right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Explicit Measures Podcast with Tommy, Mike, and Seth. Today is an interesting topic, and it's going to be really filled with a lot of conversation. I think this is talking governance for the Power BI adoption roadmap. Very great topic. I think this is going to be very well received. There's a lot of stuff. I read the article and thought, wow. But before we get into that, there's a couple maybe kind of key announcements or things that kind of happened across the community. One of which, Power BI Premium Gen 2 is now officially real, or it's a general availability. Is that right, Seth? Is that what the article saying?
GA went GA.
We went GA.
So the important thing to know there is go read the article. So if you were using the free auto scale, that costing is probably going to start taking effect here pretty soon.
They want to check your card.
check your credit card. So that one's on and running now. So that's officially out now. So we honestly, I think, Seth, you've done an extensive amount of testing on Gen 2, and the performance is just really well compared to Gen 1. It's just way better.
Night and day. You know, I mean, the capabilities that you can do on Gen 2 now, like just there is no competition. There isn't. I mean, you can have a Gen 2 capacity, and essentially for new users, listeners, they decoupled merging all of your models in memory together, right? In the overall capacity, and split it out into every single model just can't exceed the threshold.
Yep.
And like blow your mind as far as the value there. Night and day difference. Love it.
So David, the principal product manager for the Data Lake, or the Premium Gen 2. Thank you, David. We appreciate your contribution. Your hard work is paying off. It's awesome. Love the Gen 2. Mad kudos there. The only other announcement I'll throw out there is the swag.powerbi.tips store. We just came out with some new articles or new swag items. We've got a new Hasta la Vista data. I guess I should say it correctly. Hasta la Vista data. How Arnold would say it. Tommy scratching his head. If you guys can see Tommy's face.
I like your other voices better.
So we got a shirt that has some sweet shades and a phrase around data. We got a PBIX hat that just showed up. I'll try and snag these and throw these in the chat window.
That's so nerdy. It's awesome.
It's so nerdy.
It's just so.
Yeah. It's so nerdy. It's
like,
just
what is that? It's one of those. It's like, what does that mean?
It's just PBIX. That's it. Just on the hat.
Too bad it's going to be out.
PBIX.
Too bad it's going to be outdated in 2 years. So.
And it's just vintage, man.
It's just vintage.
It's going to be online. You won't even know what a PBX is in the future. It's going to be all cloud-based.
And he's got one of the PBX. Wow, I didn't even know they did that anymore.
What's PBX? What's PBX?
Yeah.
What's the PBX?
That's going to be someone on the Microsoft team saying that too.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other shirt we have is in the font of, I guess it would be SpongeBob. We have "Go ahead, make my data." So we have another fun shirt. And fun. These things just make me laugh. That's why I do them. They're hilarious. Anyways, there's some swag on the store. I'll try and capture some links here and throw them into the chat channels here in a little bit as we get going. So let's jump into today's topic. Let's talk adoption roadmap, and now we're talking specifically the topic around governance. Maybe Tommy, kick us off. Give us a couple key thoughts. There's a lot to this topic. We're gonna probably have to tackle this in a couple different episodes, but we'll just kind of there's some really interesting key phrases that popped out to us that I think as we read the article, like, these are some fundamental things. There's a lot to discuss here. So maybe Tommy, kick us off with some of those ideas.
Yeah, so a little background on this governance and kind of where we're getting our information from. This is part of the Power BI adoption roadmap that was released this year by Melissa Coates. It's kind of this whole series around user content ownership, adoption, center of excellence, user enablement, and then obviously governance is one of the nuggets in there.
Yep.
And so we're taking basically that article, which is probably the largest piece of content within the adoption roadmap.
Yeah.
And I think, today we had a lot of discussions beforehand, and it's like, how do we tackle this initially? We've had some conversations on the roadmap. We've done data culture. We've done center of excellence.
Yep.
But for governance, which is something Power BI has written about a lot extensively in the past, they used to do the Word document white papers establishing governance in your organization. So this kind of goes along right with it. So the background, at least what we're going to do, and I'll make sure to send the article in the chat. Um, we'll kind of give the official definition of data governance, and then I think kind of dive into 3 key aspects of how Microsoft introduced data governance according to the roadmap. And I think that's where we really need to start, because there's obviously a lot here, but a lot we need to define. So
Mhm.
just from the article itself, the Data Governance Institute, it's a system of decision rights and accountabilities for information related processes executed according to agreed upon models, which describe who can take what actions with what information. So that's the Institute definition, so to speak. But there are 3 statements
Mhm.
that introduced it that I want to get your guys' thoughts on, that I think we need to define before we can move forward to staffing or how do you start it. And I think the first one is the focus of governance isn't on the data, but it's what people do with the data. And that's what Melissa kind of outlines. And that's the really first thing she says is data governance is what people do with the data. True focus is on governing people's behavior with their data. So I want to start there and get your kind of definition. What does that mean to what are people doing with the data, and that's the role of governance?
Mhm. Maybe Seth, maybe some of your thoughts on some of these?
Happy Tuesday. Got that
There it
one.
was. There it is.
I just felt off.
Yeah. It wasn't right.
Yeah, I mean, wow, this is a fantastic topic. I think just in the depth of everything that's in this article, to narrow in specifically to your question, right? What is the governance? This is where we put the curbs. These are the bowling alley,
Bumpers.
bubble lane bumpers,
Yeah.
right? Where you want to make sure that when people are utilizing Power BI or any reporting tool, that you're keeping in mind the guiding factors so they don't get themselves in trouble, and whether that's in implementation or data security and not sharing information outside of the organization,
Yep.
a la published web, that kind of stuff. You set up a lot of policy, not a lot, you set up the curbs to allow people to work within and thrive in an ecosystem, but also just make sure that people are abiding by those governance strategies that are important to the organization, related to data security and what you want and how do you want data shared throughout the organization.
I feel like there's been a, and this is I think we've talked about this before, but I feel like there's been a fundamental shift in what has happened with the technology. The fact that Power BI is out and now we have this more of the online reporting based system. I think this was already happening in Excel. It has been happening in Excel for many, many years. But there's this concept of, we have information, we have data. The tooling that we've been provided as a business user hasn't been strong enough to be able to do a lot of data modeling, data shaping, bringing all these things together. And so here we are now, where Power BI comes onto the scene. We have a tool now that I think is more capable than I've seen in a business user's hands than before. And the role of IT previously, or the role of where data was being held, governed data, or whatever you want to say, that role was originally held by a small team of people who had the data. They were grooming it in servers, and then they needed to write special queries against it that's how the reporting was being handled. So we're talking about, we're not, I'm building a business object universe. I'm building these large data marts that people could consume from, but the tooling wasn't usable enough for us to be able to build our own shaping of data or blend our own sources. We had to wait for everything to get entered into the data warehouse or the EDW before you could consume it. So I feel like the tooling that we're seeing now today is this emphasis on user enablement. So my point here is the role of governing this data has previously been build the reports and disseminate those reports. That's what it was for a select team. But the needs for data has grown so large, and there's so much more data now that we're shifting away from that to saying the governing of data is now working through the availability of the data, not necessarily having to build all the reports, but giving the information out to more people. And I think as we see our younger generations of data engineers, report builders grow into this, there's a whole people are comfortable with data now. We're used to looking at graphs. the expectation is that I can get to this rawer form of the data, and we're more capable with the tools that we have now. People starting their careers is we're seeing a total shift in what's happening here with this governance of data thing. So now instead of building predefined reports, we're now focusing on how can we give you good access to data? How do we talk about the policies that go along with that data? Because we want to open that up more to more people.
Yeah, so I kind of took that almost a little kind of far reaching in terms of that statement, what people do with the data. My first thought was,
Yeah.
one, it's obviously complex because it's not just the report building and what data are you using and are you defining the metrics right, but I think it's
Yep.
especially that end user part on defining the policies on what people can, when they're looking at a report, are those things well defined, documented? Can people find those definitions? And then
Agreed.
how can they communicate that? So
Yep.
basically, if you had a report that was maybe team specific, is that something you can share with leadership? Is this universal or is this kind of team specific? Does that make sense across teams? Can someone download it in Excel and again then kind of shape it themselves? And what is the kind of the tail end of end user self-service, so to speak, that they can do? Is this certain data sets? And again, is that communication side? So that's where I see also that what are people doing with it? It's not just using the report. It's really that other part on, that they can do it well. They can, be use the data in an optimized way. They understand it, but also they know how to communicate and they know what they're communicating. Because I think that's where people run into a lot of problems in terms of it's not just the report has wrong data. It's the data might be great, right for a certain context, but without, I think, any policies in place that can say what this data is defining, that's when you run into miscommunication. Obviously, with all the parts in terms of building the report, the scope, making sure you're using the right data and the right standards. But I think just as important as that part when we're talking about governance is how do we define these things and when there's change management. So the business rules and the business definitions.
I think when I read the article, I was thinking a lot about Power BI governance. I kept thinking around like top down rules that restrict what you're doing. And I think the article tries to emphasize a lot in the article that governance is not that. Emphasis around governance is more around enablement of those
Mhm.
users, making sure that they can get access to the data. And that's something I've been very vocal about is our role has changed. No longer are we trying to just, you know, build
Restrict.
restrict data and get reports going, but it's rather we have tools that have the capability. How do we build a process around governing what can you consume, what can you build, and then how to promote what you've built into sanctioned, governed, regulated things that the business relies on? Because I was already doing this. I was already building Excel sheets for my team that had all the information that I needed to make decisions for our team. We that's it just happens. So now what you're doing is you're moving this into more of a public facing piece or an area where those reports can be shared across organizationally. It's all online. It's on my mobile phone. It's now on my desktop. So I feel like the whole game here is slightly changing.
I'm gonna introduce a series of controversial thoughts today. I think I would love some feedback on this though. As I read, in the adoption roadmap overview, right?
Hmm.
What is governance? To me, there's kind of two sections, and I would almost say we split them. Right. The first part is like data governance is a set of policies and procedures that define the ways in which an organization wants data to be used.
Yep.
Cool. When adopting Power BI, the goal of governance is to empower the internal user community to the greatest extent possible, comma, while adhering to the industry, governmental, contractual requirements, regulations, etc.
Yeah.
And to your point, Mike, I agree with this, but I almost think this is two different things, right? Because if I mishmash this, like, and I take the first sentence and the last part of the last sentence, that's what governance is to me. Like, you have a body that is setting policies and procedures, it's adhering to industry, governmental, contractual requirements, or whatever. And
Hmm.
then right in the middle is this: when adopting Power BI, the goal of governance is to empower the internal user community to the greatest extent possible. We are all huge proponents of that.
Yes.
But I almost wonder if that, like, if you put governance as a piece to this, but they're not is that the same person? Like, in my mind, the person who's like, no, Sue, you have to do this, and this is exactly how you do this because this is the way of the world. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yep.
That is not the person that is going to be okay with Sue going 1, 3, 5.
Yep.
Right?
Mhm.
Yep.
You in my mind, there's almost like do you almost have governance and then this intermediary of like where and how that's applied, goes through a body or a person where it's like, okay, yeah, in this case, it totally makes sense that you're doing this. We know what these policies and procedures are.
Yes.
Like, what is that process? Because I understand what you're trying to accomplish, Sue, and I want to empower you and not hold you back.
Yep.
But I need to keep you away from Bob.
Yep.
Right? And Bob's going to say, you can't do that. And that's where I think a lot of the organizations fall apart or have problems, where you create these strategies, you create these processes and procedures that are actually detrimental to what Power BI allows a business to do, which is, expand and rapidly grow and, make data available to as many people as possible and empower them.
Yep.
So like like in my mind, as I'm thoroughly adapting and figuring out what my strategy is going to be.
Yep.
Just in terms of rolling Power BI out internally, because a lot of our focus has been external
Mhm.
embedded
Power BI,
power,
yeah.
and it's not to say we haven't used it, but
Yep.
there's certainly a much larger launch coming that I almost wonder, like I can kind of see like, yeah, this guy's going to be really good at this,
Yeah.
but we're going to keep him over here. kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
thing. Like, I'd be interested in your thoughts of like, is that the same team? Because those ideas conflict so much, or is there, a stopgap in there
Well,
where you should have
let's
them
let's start.
regulated?
Yeah, let's start with that word, that user empowerment, because that's that other
Huge.
statement.
I think that's
And
huge.
let's talk about like how would you say, what is that like, basically, like what, how
Agreed.
would you define that in the context of
Okay. So,
in adoption?
and I love this point. I think you're bringing up a great point, Tommy, because I think, Seth, your point around how do we negotiate giving data out in a secure way that they understand the guardrails as we give you more data. And so the comment, one of the items here in the governing success factors area of the article, it starts talking about the answer to new requests for data should not be no by default, which is set. Sometimes that's what we're saying. Sometimes that individual, right? I want this extra. I want this sales data. I want this product pricing data. Answer's no, and we move on. And like instead, they said, but rather it should be yes and with simple and transparent rules that define what the governance requirements are for this data access. So I feel like the idea here is we're not trying to take away your permissions for data. We're not trying to take away, if you need the
want
more
to.
information, the goal here is to make it available to you, but make it available to you with like, make sure you understand what you're getting into. What are the pieces that we're talking about here?
Mhm.
How is this going to be engaged with? What are the what goes along with the responsibility of this data? And so I really feel like there's some kind of formal thing here that we're talking about is, as we talk about this governing item, let's say I have a team of 3 people, right? This is like a charter. And there's actually a couple notes here down here later on in the article. It's talking about you should have some charters kind of written out to charter what this data thing will look like. And what is our charter as the governing team? What is our charter as the center of excellence? And how do we get people engaged there? So the idea is, as my team goes from 3 to 9 to 25, because it's going to have to grow, because data is becoming more and more important within an organization. As that thing grows, what are the charters, or what are the things I can give to these new individuals and say, read this, go through this thing. Let's discuss this governance article and talk about, like, you can't publish our pricing information externally. Only eyes can see this stuff are these people. These are policies that we've defined internally as an organization to say, yes, you can have access to this data, but here are the restrictions with that. And if you go outside of these guardrails, we're going to have to pull restrictions. We're going to pull it back, because that's
But
not how we're going to use it.
but is that user empowerment though?
I mean, I think,
Well, Mike makes a good point. Like I think
Like, I
like
agree. Yeah.
in here, right? Like, user empowerment is not restricting people from getting access to data.
no.
However, like, say they want some data that is been flagged in governance, that
yeah.
like, listen, there's a checkpoint here,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Like, and that runs through the non-governance person or whomever,
Yep.
right? To just be like, hey, I need access to this data. What's the fit purpose? Okay, that meets our guidelines. Hey, be wary, right? Like, this is the stuff that can't go out, whatever, or it's
Exactly.
flagged in some way. And like, you're not removing the ability for them to go get it, because I
Right.
think in all of our experiences, even before Power BI came along, these aren't new conversations,
No,
right? But what did business users do?
go to Excel.
Like, okay, you're not gonna give it to me. I'll get it, and then I'm gonna throw it in an Access database, and
Yep.
you're not even gonna know it exists.
Yeah.
And like now you have a real problem, right? Like
Right.
then you have data that shouldn't exist outside of a realm, right? And they're not sourcing it from your systems anymore. They're doing their own thing.
So
So
I'll say, yeah, go ahead.
no, that
So I was going to say, so user empowerment to me is really a few things. It's one, there's clear expectations. So a user can easily know if they're how to request a report. There's a clear path to request a project to optimize, to build something in, from an automation or from a report point of view where they can integrate. There's a clear path to get that request, or a clear path to understand what's capable.
Yes.
So the expectations align, because you can't really empower someone unless they know the avenues they need to go. If I need a Power App to integrate my data to build and write,
Yep.
I know where to go to get it, and I know the expectations of what we can do. If I need a report, I know the request, I know what the expectations are for me as a stakeholder, and I know what the BI team can do. And that part of that empowerment too is I also am not overwhelmed when I'm looking at the data, that when I know these reports, I know their intentions.
Yep.
I know the data, because it's not just something in Power BI that should reflect the business. So if you have all these KPIs and metrics, that should reflect the business they're already in.
And I think, but I think potentially, Tommy, you're going. I feel like I slightly agree with what you're saying, but in some way I slightly disagree here a little bit, because I think the governance part here is talking more about the data and a little bit less around the report build portion of this, right? So I feel like a lot of the article is talking about governance of access to the information, data marts, models, tables of information, more so than actually, like, yes, there's definitely a clear expectation of, as reports are being built or as reports are coming out of the governing team, there should be clear expectations and clear definitions of what's going on there and how to read those things. I think that's part of this. But I feel like governance here is being a bit broader than just focusing on the reports and the data in those reports. It's more about, like, overarching, like, we need to enable our users. We can't create every single report for the organization.
Yeah.
We have to be able to, like, let this out, be open at a wider level. And I think for me, more the governance is, let's build a process to figure out, okay, we've got Tommy and a couple of people on his team building reports, as well as we're now exposing just tables of information or models, predefined models, to people to build their own reports. I feel like a part of governance here is letting the broader organization build their own stuff, find value from them, and figuring out how to figure out which one of those reports are important, adding value, and promoting them and maintaining them. Because a lot of later on in the article, towards the bottom, it starts talking about, well, how do you continue to roll this out and provide, like, an SLA around that data? Who's going to maintain it? Like, yeah, you've taken this, here's our product, our products library and our sales numbers, and someone has appended to that an Excel sheet that has some other enrichment data that goes along with that. As that report becomes more important, or as it becomes used more, how do we migrate that into, like, okay, who's going to own this moving forward? What additional columns of data is in here? And if it's something that's wrong, who do we go to fix that data? I think the governing policy just define that interaction across those teams.
I agree, but I would still argue that the definitions and the terminology is absolutely part of governance. It has to be. Just like if, let's say, the state of Illinois said we're going to invest $250 million in highways, right? You have to define what a highway is first before you can invest in it. There's a set of policies and basically restrictions that say what a highway is.
Agreed. But then you have companies like Uber saying, I'm going to use these highways, but I'm going to make a thing called an Uber. Like, it has nothing to do with the government at all. But it's like something. It's another defined thing that has to be brought into this ecosystem of, like, okay, let's talk about Uber. It's an entirely separate company that uses your highway. That. Yeah, no, I'm just saying.
No, I agree. But I'm saying, like you have to start, like, the user should be able to know, like, if they're requesting a report, it should align with business. Like, the data shouldn't necessarily create anything new, so to speak. It should be ideas, methodologies, and top like entities that already exist in that certain department or that company, right?
To it, this is where I think maybe I disagree a little bit.
Okay.
Is I think some of this stuff is defined, right? There's certain things like what how do we count sales? How do we count what is a product? Like when do like there's some core things that I think as an organization that you define, but I think there's also this flexibility as to like let these departments or individuals discover what they find value, because there may be additional metrics or KPIs or additional um, you know ideas around data that are valuable added, but they're added to that data set not by that team, right? So I think maybe what I'm saying here is there's maybe an interplay between where the governance comes from, where the original source of data comes from, and there's also this area where we have a like the center of excellence. So in later, I think halfway down the article, it starts talking about the center of excellence is establishing a COE for the people, right? So this is where we have what Tommy's defining here is, hey, this is how we're defining these things. Those center of excellence people, cross organizational members, are helping, coming back and bringing feedback and saying, hey, this doesn't work for me, or this is not how I define it. How can we align on what the definition of some of these things mean? Or I have this new metric that I think is relevant and we use it in our department all the time. I'd like to define what this means so that other people potentially could use it as well.
But you're outlining several things down below, like how do you implement,
True.
governance? Is it on a business unit level or a
Yep.
different area, or organizationally?
Agreed.
And there's pros and cons that are clearly outlined in here that I agree with, from the standpoint that if you do it on a lower level, you have problems rolling that up.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Everybody has their own definition. Does that mean that it shouldn't exist? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I agree with
Right.
that.
But if there is an organizational level of uniform master data, like I don't care who you are, it's your job to figure out how it aligns, because if that number is supposed to mean something to an executive, it better match up with the other
Right.
business units.
Agreed.
Right. So I think there's a mix in there.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to weigh in a ton, because I think all of us fall on the side of like, or hope, like empowering users and not restricting people from doing what they need to do.
Yes.
Or how they want, provided it falls in line with, how the organization wants to manage that.
So allow me to double down with the question to you, Mike, and I want to see where you think this aligns, and then we can move on. But just because I really am actually interested where you think this is actually would be placed. Let's say you had a transaction at a billing country, at a country based on the account was purchased, and at an account based on a sales rep. Each of these have a different sales region, so to speak.
Sure.
Who defines what, like, if you're actually counting sales by region, where that goes? Like which in a sense field do you use? The billing country, the account country? So where does that fall into governance?
So this is where I think you look at, how does the organization want to count? So I think the answer is it depends, right? So I think it's going to depend on well, it's going to depend on your audience, right? So if this report is going up to leadership, right? Your leadership is going to define, this is how I need to see the data. This is how we're going to define how sales are being counted, because this stuff impacts people's benefits or their bonuses, right? So what I'm thinking here is like, this has real implications on what's going on. So someone is going to look at this and say, there is and this is where I think some of the center of excellence part becomes in this. So I've also dealt with the challenges of like supply chain, right? Supply chain's they have metrics. They want to have a fill rate of their products to customers at a certain ratio, but you can count things all kinds of, like, hey, I shipped it, but it didn't make it there. That still counts. Or it left my factory, or it actually arrived at the customer's facility. I think there are things, but I think those conversations have to be had, and you have to agree upon what those things are, what that metric means to the organization. So if in intra-department, right, you may need to measure things differently based on certain individuals, right? So in a department, we may have to look at it two different ways with two different lenses for that information. But when we report up to leadership or the C-level of our company, we may only need to have one grouping of this. This is how we define that information. So I think you have to define what it means and how you measure success. I mean, I think that's what you're talking to right here. Someone needs to define that.
And I'm not saying the governance board. Yeah, go ahead.
But there's no reason why I couldn't have, like, inside a department, right? In my sales team, I may look at this information different ways to try and figure out what is happening. Like, why is this region higher than that region? Well, let's look at what's going on here, and maybe there was a whatever. I think there's information that maybe at the department level that they may actually try and slice it and dice it different ways, knowing full well that when we talk about sales, we're talking about the sale of origin, the company that bought it from that region. That's what we do when we talk about sales by country. But you know all well, like when you're in the data trying to analyze what's going on, well, this company's based out of a different region. That's why that region got those sales credit. But in reality, most of the conversation came from my team in my region. So, like, there's always seems to be like exceptions
Yeah.
to the rule kind of thing.
So what I'll say is I don't think the governance board would define that metric, but I think the governance board is responsible for having a policy in place for how that gets defined.
I would
When
agree.
you have some,
I would agree with that. And I think it's
yeah.
So I think the governance board or the center of excellence. I mean, again, I think you can. There's another in the article later on. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry. Towards the bottom, they start talking about if you have a data governance team, right? Some organizations are large enough where they actually have a team that defines what data governance is doing. If you have a team that does that, right, that team should be part of the center of excellence and the communicating like these are some of our expectations. This is how we're measuring things. When we talk about profit and sales, these are how we're defining these key metrics. And I think this is also where when we have some of these in more important reports, things that are being built by the BI team, we define what these metrics mean, and that becomes the standard. And if there's other reports that bubble up into the organization that don't have those standards being applied, who's to say another team can't make another measure to define what the sales are by month? We need something to say that doesn't adhere.
But I guess think about this in this terms, like, and I'm not saying a team can't have their own metrics, but if an organization is going through the process of defining metrics because they have this challenge that different departments are calling things, like as an organization, I'm not telling you can't use your own metrics for your reports, but you better not be sending them my way.
Exactly.
Right.
That's the point.
But,
Yes.
but I think Tommy's right from the standpoint that if those metrics are defined on a higher level for the organization, those will always win. Like you have to abide by that. Like you're going to build big processes around transforming, the information in the appropriate way from the different teams to make sure that they align to the higher level number that the executives want to see.
And my argument is you're not going to empower anybody if there's all these ambiguous metrics that mean the same thing. If you had this country one, it's like, oh, well, this report shows sales by region. This other one's by sales by the CRM account. But it's not clearly defined in each report, nor is like which one should we use in what situation. Like at least that policy in place, like empowering someone means they're not overwhelmed and they understand what they're looking at. So they can use the data the way it was intended.
I mean, another thing that we're going to run into here too is as we talk about like what metrics are, people want to make sure the data looks good, right? You don't ever want to walk into a team meeting and be like, "Oh, look, my sales are down 30% year over year." So so defining what success is in these metrics, I think, is very important. I mean, to your point, Tommy, right? We do need like a common definition on things, but I'm also saying I have a hesitation around. This is where I hesitate, right? On one end of the spectrum, I agree that there has to be standards and how we measure things, because then we could really know if our performance good or bad. And then this I think starts talking to data culture now, right? If we feel like we need to hide in our performance inside our data and we're trying to manipulate things such that our numbers look better artificially, is our data are we penalizing people for having bad performance? And is our motivation for shifting the data around now becoming out of this need to like not get our hands slapped because of what we did or did not do? Or are we having like a data culture where we're like, okay, the data says this, let's just respond to it, let's come up with a plan, let's work through what happened. Okay, fine, we think we understand what was the root cause here of this, or at least we think we do, we have a theory around it. Let's try something new, let's try something different. Well, okay, we spent too much on marketing, that killed our sales, or whatever, we spent money in the wrong place. That's fine. I think this is also part of like this data culture thing too, right? If you have a caustic data culture, you will try to hide things. And if you don't, you'll actually use the data to provide answers.
Your governance body is going to be very big.
Exactly. Yes. But I mean, I you know what? I don't think I feel like we can only know what we know, and if we're using data to make decisions, we need to have accurate data to help us make the right decisions. We can't be hiding things in there.
You go into another good point, another statement in here, which I don't know how I actually feel based on my first reaction is it says governance strategy will be defined by the organization's data culture.
Yes, and that's where I was going with this.
Yeah. So I don't know. It feels like a chicken or the egg kind of thing. And I'm going to let Seth talk because I can tell
Well, I think this is a good spot to my first point, I guess, wasn't as argumentative as I thought it was going to be. So maybe this one is. So as I read through this article, I I I couldn't help myself, especially when I got to the end, to all of the sudden think that this was two completely different topics. And let me explain a little bit what I mean, right? Like I really think the golden nugget that I've been looking for in the adoption roadmap was down towards like roles and responsibilities, right? I was looking for some sort of guidance on like, great. Like in the overview, I have these boxes and I see the relationships between them. Um, Governance, has its piece as far as policies, whatever. But all of the sudden, like I personally think it almost feels like what is called governance strategy is not just governance, right? It's like I think it should have been like more a prominent piece in the diagram itself and
Mhm.
just been called strategy because I would have liked to have started here, because the roles and responsibility area covers all of the other areas of the adoption roadmap in detail, and I think it would have helped me understand like who owns the different parts and how do these pieces like tie together, because there's so much detail in each one of these pieces as far as like the COE and the community of practice and how do you support and empower users. But like a lot of like governance to me is the first part we talked about. You put guardrails on people.
Hmm.
And then the strategy of like how all this fits together has to be freeing, has to be like
Mhm.
allow users to use data and have access to data in ways that Power BI just explodes the doors off of information. Like you think about the challenges that we have in business intelligence, from 10 years ago, right? You couldn't deal with the volumes of data that we do now, but now you can, and
Yes.
now we just need a way to wrap our minds around all of the volume of data, and Power BI allows us to do that. And when you can wrangle data
Yes.
and you can take big swaths of information that by themselves in your 200,000 row Excel spreadsheet aren't going to do you much, and you start to aggregate them together, which is why
Yep.
pivot tables,
Yep.
like that's
Exists.
why they're so good and people love them,
Yes.
because it allows you to make meaning out of data. And Power BI just takes that to the next level throughout an organization, because you're like, oh great, like I can mash up these things now. Not only that, I can create multiple different visualizations, they interact and they filter with each other, and we can do all these amazing things that bring insight
Yes.
out of all these things, right? So the the thing I'm stuck with here is I almost think that a lot of the roles and responsibility, the staffing accountability, like considerations and key actions within this article, I, I wouldn't have. I see why they're under governance, but I don't know if I would have put them there, because I almost visualize this as like this would have been a horizontal bar on the right hand side of the adoption roadmap where it was just like strategy. Like there's so many great nuggets. I think we will need another podcast to dive
Mhm.
into
Yep.
down below, because there's practical examples of how do you implement some of these pieces. And it's not just like the governance piece.
Yeah.
It's like, what is the COE? What is their role and how they interact with like these policies and procedures? Like,
Yep.
what does that look like? And guys, my mind was blown with the amount of information that is on the second half, like
Yeah.
not even, right? But even like where this dovetails even further, I guess, for me, is even in the top section under governance strategy, I would say of the 2, 4, 6, 7 bullets there, right? The first 5 are that strategy piece. It's about empowering people. It's about ensuring data usage is,
Yep.
appropriate and working within the business. It's about, developing the vision, right? And then the other 2 are what I would expect governance to be, which is like, I'm going to lock down your stuff. You can't do that. know there's a regulation, there's an industry, and there's security, right? Whether you want them to be there or not, they're part of an organization, and you have to be mindful of the fact that if we open that gate for you, you are now responsible for, XYZ.
Yeah. No, I think with a lot of this governance things, there's this expectation that like I think we can't just expect to turn on data and people just know what to do with it. I think this is a lot
Mhm.
of what this governance is talking to is we need a plan. And so I really, really like the diagram they show here. There's introducing governance to your organization. There's three kind of key patterns on how governance around Power BI is kind of handled. And again, with everything that I lean for is I love this agile process. I love this idea of like do a little bit of governance, implement a little Power BI, do some more thought about governance, implement a little more Power BI. But it talks about like, hey, if you want to be quick, you want to go fast, light up Power BI for your entire organization. People will figure out how to build stuff. They just will. Like it's you can roll out Power BI, let people start working with it in the same way they've worked with Excel. There will be individuals that can take it and run with that lead. But the downside of that is you now have to backpedal a bit and put policies in place because it's going to get used however people see fit. People won't always do things through best practices. On the second half of this, item number 2 is kind of like talking about we can do all the planning up front and then roll out Power BI. But now you have to have and this is like a very top-down approach where you have to have a clear expectation. But this might make sense in companies that already have strong data governance policies. You already have a center of excellence around data and things inside your organization. If you already have these teams set up, you should probably bring Power BI to them first and say, let's figure out how to use this tool. Let's leverage this, figure out what would work best, and then roll it out to the organization. And then there's approach 3 where it's kind of like this iterative approach. Do a little bit of governance, roll out some Power BI, work with a team, figure out what they need, figure out how to work with governance with them. And then so it's kind of like this backwards pattern. And one comment in the article that stuck out to me really well was data governance is never done. You don't get to a state where it's over. We've done it. Governance is a thing. It's like it's this continual process of growth, and you're always kind of as more data comes in, I think it's always something you're going to revisit and keep looking at.
It's an interesting one because there's more than one path, and Chris Wagner actually reached out to me this morning because he saw the kind of notice for the topic today. He's like, he asked me to mention that we don't have to have everything in place to start, and you don't have to have an official center of excellence to start your governance.
I agree with that.
And it's funny with the data culture like that, the governance strategy will be defined by the data culture. I can't wrap my head around what is dependent on one another. Where it's like if you don't have a data culture or you have a really one that needs to be improved, how can you start governance and or the other way around? Like, can you actually have a good data culture without having any governance?
I mean,
in place.
This is something I think we talked about beforehand, right?
Yeah.
If you have IT owns all data and no one can touch anything, and we don't give you any data, what you find is whatever reporting that is out there, users are going to go dump it out in Excel sheets and go do their own little. This is where access lights up all over the place in your organization because people are doing extracts from data servers that are too large to handle. So I just do my data manipulation offline. So there's the ability here to like you can clamp down so hard that it forces other people to get answers other ways because it's inefficient. People, honestly, at the end of the day, people are lazy. They want this stuff to be easy for them to get to.
Yeah, and ultimately, like that Mike is where I think you need to land, right? And I'm beginning to see where this
where's what you need
strategy,
to land. I missed that point.
Where you make it as easy as possible for the lay information worker.
Yeah, I thought you were saying to clamp down on all the data. I'm like, I don't think you agree with
that. No, you're right. I don't. So Tommy, I think the interplay here revolves around the fact that a lot of the second half of this, and we are going to need another podcast for this, is vision and strategy, right?
Yeah.
I've been looking at the adoption roadmap of like, how do I develop my strategy to deploy, these pieces within my organization?
Yep.
And you're going to fast butt up against your data culture.
Yes. Really
in
quick.
terms of how you can deploy these strategies, depending on whether or not your data culture is supportive or saying, we don't care what you're doing, and then you're in a microcosm, right? And it doesn't mean you can't build better processes or have parts of this within your org. It's just not going to be as big, right? But if
Yeah.
I have an organization that is 100% on board, right? Now you're talking about a lot of the things that we'll touch base with in a future blog or future podcast, which is how do you, like, what are those challenges in rollout? Like, how do you set up this project, right? Because it's a
Mhm.
massive project throughout the organization. Who are the owners? How do you set up the RACI? Like, RACI is that term for like responsible, accountable, consulted, informed, right?
Yep.
What are the business processes that need to be built to create the gates that data like all of that is
Yeah.
dependent on whether or not your organization believes that this investment is important,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And that is where these things like really lock in, and where I'm excited about the future podcasts, because there's so much awesome information about setting up a strategy
Yes.
in the latter parts of this article
Totally.
that we absolutely need to dive into in detail, because that's where, like, all of a sudden I was like, woo, like now I'm keyed in. Like, now I have a path of like how all these interconnected pieces start to fit together. And I think to make a final point around like introducing governance to your organization, like that you were kind of outlining, right? Each of those is like presents challenges. Like, if you
Mhm.
have Power BI that rolled out already and
Yeah.
now you're going to apply governance, I
Yep.
think that's the hardest
I would.
way to implement, because it's like wrangling cats. And we also know very well through experience of us interacting with our user group members and others, that like the monumental task of reining in how people have already set their daily routines using Power
Exactly.
BI and things, you have to change again
Yes.
what they learned.
Yes. Exactly.
And I think
Or
that's
help
where
them
I get
relearn what they learned
that,
incorrectly, kind of thing.
right. And
Yeah.
that's where like, my point is, I don't want to be like full governance planning and then roll it out like in this
Yeah.
big
Mhm.
waterfall kind of way.
Yep.
But I do think that it's extremely important to nail the strategy and vision parts, build the core pieces for that lay person to quickly understand where they go.
Yep.
Even if it needs to be developed, you're not changing their paths. You're just like, get on the super highway, man. All you have to worry about is like, here's the direction, and we're just going to keep building road in front of you, but you don't have to dovetail off.
Yeah.
Like, our
Exactly.
thing is, we don't want you off the freeway.
Yeah.
And if you set that up, then when you hit those challenges, I think, of implementation across business units with people, et cetera, whatever, you can adapt, build new processes, build new adoption, start small with a business area, whatever, and then roll it out bigger and bigger. And then it can be iterative.
Yeah.
But if you don't fundamentally sit down and figure out what your vision and your strategy for implementing large, big organizational changes, or even in your own business unit, like, that's where all of a sudden you got people, like, even if you
Mhm.
grab their attention, you're like, I'm going to change the way you do your daily job. Here's how you do that. And then 5 steps later, they're like, what do I do now? And you're like, I don't know. We have to go back and take a month to figure this out. You're dead. Like, you just lost them. And
Lost them.
now you're in one where they're going to figure out how to do it on their own. And then you're going to have a harder time convincing them to get back on your freeway.
Yep.
It's almost like data governance and that play with data culture is very much like Mario 64. And allow me to explain kind of thing.
Oh
So
boy.
because
It's
the whole
blocky and not as good a graphics as
si-
the other
64 is
systems.
amazing. So with like, because the article outlines everything, activities, success factors, key outputs, and kind of what success looks like for governance, like from a fully mature model. But that, I think that interplay with data culture is, there's a lot of restrictions in here. It's almost like locked worlds that you shouldn't focus on yet until your data culture reaches certain milestones.
That's a
And
good
I
point.
think that's probably what they mean. Probably what Melissa means by the governance strategy will be defined by the data culture, is understanding where's our data culture now. So here's the things that we can begin to roll out from the governance. If your data culture and everyone's convoluted and kind of like you're on the maturity level 1 on your data culture, you can't just start rolling out new policies and process. So you have to stand where your data culture is now and then what you can work on. It's almost like everything else is locked out until you power up or level up. on your data culture, and then you can start prioritizing those other data governance
Then you
strategies.
get other levels. Yeah.
Then you get other levels. Then you
Yeah.
can go to the other worlds, but
E-
you can't
So
get there
so what I heard
until your culture is at a certain state.
So what I heard from Tommy is we are infants running around until we eat the first mushroom. We don't get to get bigger, and then we don't get to spit fireballs until we eat the little flower plant.
You can't go to Koopa Town unless you have 15 stars. So basically,
I mean, I agree, Tommy. I think there's a lot. This article is too large. There's a on the left hand side on the adoption roadmap. There's just one word called governance. In here, there are so many topical headers that are so relevant to talk about. Like I'm just going to name a couple that I think are just what we're talking about right now is very relevant. There's an area called governance challenges. There's an area called governance planning. There's another area called I could go in here, governance policies. And then another header around and inside that governance policies, there's a lot of like these little like informational boxes that go along down the article, and there's one like really big red one that stands out to me, and it says, and this is where I think there's so much to this topic. This could have been broken out to many articles, but this one area says having a lot of documentation can lead to the false sense that everything is under control. I'm like 100%. Like that speaks to the data culture, right? If we come in and just say, here's the documentation for everything and how it works, and we expect you to read it all, and you don't actually come in with like, this is how we do business, and you don't make that documentation part of your culture, other people, it needs to be kind of self-regulated. People need to be like, hey, you built that thing that's kind of out of the bounds of what we're doing here for data culture pieces. Let's rein that in, or here, have these tables, but it has to be part of the culture. And then it says, having everything documented and that false sense of everything is under control can lead to complacency. The level of engagement of your center of excellence with the community or the broader user community is one way to ensure that your governance guidelines and policies are followed. Having that continual interaction, that continual conversation, it's never over. We're always talking about things. People are going to think of really creative ways to use their data. Fine, so be it. Let the self-service part of this stuff just grow. But we need like policies around this to allow it to be able to get, how do we evaluate of all the reports that are self-servicing, which ones are good ones to promote and which ones do we need to refine because maybe it doesn't really meet our policies. And I think this is, again, so many good articles here. And man, it talks about staffing and accountability of this stuff as well. And then it gives you like the roles and responsibility. This article is super dense. There's so much good information here.
So what are you saying, Mike? We're probably going to talk about it again?
Nah, I think this is it. We're done. It's just this topic only. Let's move on to Charticulator.
Yeah.
Restricted governance.
I'm restricting this conversation. This data governance conversation
is restricted.
Blocked from my organization.
Firewall.
Never use it. I waste too much time on it. Awesome. Well, we've burned through pretty much a full hour, and there's probably a lot more we could continually unpack here. I think this is probably a good break point. A lot of good points, a lot of good talking points. For those of you who have not read this governance document, if you are even, I would say from a recommendation standpoint, if you are starting to look at Power BI, if you are starting to think about this as something your organization will roll out, or if you're an admin in your organization who's evaluating or implementing Power BI, you have to read this. This one article should be read before you start anything in Power BI. I firmly believe that this is, out of all the articles I've read so far in the adoption roadmap, this is the strongest one. This has the most advice. This has a ton of practical takeaways that you could implement tomorrow inside your company. And I think this, talking about governance, is really, and I think, Tommy, we actually did a survey on Power BI tips. What part of Power BI do you most spend your time in? And like no one writes governance at all. Like Seth was like, I hit governance. I said yes on the governance, so you had one vote for governance. But to that point though, like yes, you can employ Power BI. Yes, self-service is great. Yes, there's a lot of things that can happen here that enable your organization to do great things with data. But I think this governance conversation needs to be had earlier in the conversation. And if nothing else, people just need to be aware of it. Like this is something we need to think about.
Yeah, I would.
Wow.
If I were to do over,
yeah,
I would have gone
Here.
overview and then right into governance, like
Yeah.
into the second half of all of this, like not the hard policy creation part, but just the
Sure.
strategy.
Yep.
But in terms of articles, I agree. I would go here, and then this to me gives context to a lot of other things. And
I'd agree with that.
I like for sure, let's dive into this further into the strategy parts and just like some awesome goodness that is in this article and in some future podcasts for sure. So I would actually invite the audience, come along this journey with us, right? Dive into the governance doc. We're going to be talking about it at least one more time.
Yep.
Use the EMP mailbag to drop some areas that might have jumped out to you.
Yeah.
And we'll make sure we emphasize them, because there's probably like 5 podcasts worth of stuff in this article alone, but we'll see.
We'll have to see if we can like stop doing a high level overview. We're going to probably take this one and break it down into sections and say, let's just talk about this one area of governance and not talk about because we could literally, we could be totally on ADD this entire topic. It's just all over the place. Anyways,
100%.
with that, we just say thank you very much for watching the podcast. If you got some value out of this, if you were able to kind of argue with us and wrestle through some of these things around governance yourself, our only ask for you is find someone else in your company who is interested in Power BI and just please share it with them. Let them know, like, hey, this is a great podcast. You might find some value. So our only ask to you as a listener is share it with one other person and see if they find some additional value from the podcast that you found. And with that, Tommy, where can you find the podcast?
So if you're listening live right now, you can actually subscribe on any podcast platform, get all of our episodes. You can download them on any podcast platform, Apple, Spotify, Overcast. If you're listening to the podcast right now and you want to join the conversation, we have a pretty lively chat. Join every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central on YouTube and LinkedIn. Just follow Power BI Tips social accounts. And again, make sure to spread the word. If you like to use Twitter or LinkedIn, we'd love to get more people on board. We love the community here. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much. And we'll see you on Thursday.